Okay, I think we'd better get going on the final session, which I suppose is probably not entropic, it's probably climactic rather than, well, it's one of the two. But I mean, these things do tend to tail off a bit, but I think there's lift and bounce on this session. So it's the same sort of procedure as usual, so I'll briefly introduce all the speakers now and then just summon you in, as you need. Arvind Sharma opens the morning's proceedings. Burke's Professor of Comparative Religion at McGill, University of Montreal, but very much a product of another place in Boston, which is unmentionable here. Arvind, I'm sorry about that, but you can't help these things. And is presently, as I say, Burke's Professor of Comparative Religion at McGill, University of Montreal. Many other honours and invitations to fellowships and visiting professorships in a very wide range. John F. Kennedy School of Government, as well as other institutions. So is an elected fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society and comes from a Hindu background, which introduces a different dimension to our discussions from the point of view of the religious take on this question. So Arvind is the first of our speakers, and then Dean Zimmerman is the second of them. I always think that one says these things, well, so-and-so needs no further introduction, he's so well known, and then you proceed to get a long, tedious introduction. Well, Dean is one of those, but it's very interesting, isn't he, that I couldn't make out from the biog that we've got here as to whether he is the organizer of mayhem or just the cause of it. But anyway, he's one or the other of the two. I mean, it's fascinating to hear about mayhem, but the metaphysical mayhem sounds like sort of higher mayhem of a very distinguished order. But anyway, is in Rutgers as a metaphysician, and in the philosophy of religion. He's taught in Notre Dame as well. And have you been in Princeton, or is it just Princeton that publishes the series that you contribute to?
They just publish.
Yeah. Anyway, I couldn't keep my eyes off mayhem. I thought that sounds like an excellent way to entropically finish things here. And then Joel Premack, who really does not need any introduction. And I'm not really going to give you one, Joel. I mean, you have been, I mean, not only you and Nancy conducted a very, very distinguished series of Terry lectures here some years ago, but you've been at the centre of attention when it comes to the organising of this kind of conference, because you're just the kind of person who one wants to have at this kind of thing. So you're very welcome here particularly. And Catherine Tanno is a newcomer, seduced from Chicago, and we've been wanting to get her to come here for many, many years, and at last, with a great sigh of relief, Kathy lands here as a professor of systematic theology in the Divinity School just next door, so she's now a colleague of mine. And it's going to be very interesting to hear from her, because she negotiates very interesting relationships between systematic theology and the social sciences, in particular economics, in a more recent book. So it's going to be very interesting to hear your take on this particular issue, where I think you're probably almost as much out of your depth as I am, which is really saying something. So that's the cast, and we kick off with you, Arvind, and if you'd just come up and do your thing. Thank you.
I presume I can go on till 11, right?
Yeah. I'll cut you off at 11.
I see. Fine. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And I apologize for not being at the conference right from the beginning. You can blame the usual suspect, another conference. Yeah. And I'm all at sea at this conference. But I have lived in the academia long enough to realize that ignorance is not always a disadvantage. Right? So I shall be cashing in on that. And begin my discussion of the Hindu perspective on why is there anything, by pointing out that the Hindu tradition is pluralistic, as I had to do last time as well. In fact, over lunch yesterday, we had this discussion. There's a wisecrack going on in India that the West has created 3 religions out of one God. And Hinduism has created one religion out of hundreds of gods. Now I'll say what I have to say in 3 parts. I will make some introductory remarks to clarify the general background of Hindu thought. The second part would be more rigorous. I would run through about 9 major schools of Indian thought and try to connect them with our theme. How would they see this issue? Why is there anything? And finally, I would conclude with what seems to me to be a major issue in the most alive segment of Indian thought at the moment, which is the Vedantic tradition. About 3/4 of all Indian intellectuals subscribe to one school of Hindu thought known as Advaita Vedanta. Vedanta in general has an even broader following. So I will respect that orientation and say some things about from the perspective of this one school, Vedanta. Now, the initial points I need to make are 6. Having already said that Hinduism is more like an encyclopedia than a textbook, basically. Okay. That Hinduism has many formations in its historical development. And in Vedic Hinduism, that is the Hinduism contained in the Vedas, there is considerable discussion of creation in our conventional sense. And who made this world? What was the tree? What was the wood? What was the tree? Out of which the gods fashioned heaven and earth? I think questions of this kind are asked. But I am not a specialist on Vedic thought. I shall be dealing with classical Hinduism, Hinduism from around 400 BC onwards, which crystallized into identifiable systems of philosophy. So you might get more material on the Western, in relation to the Western perspective on creation, from the Vedic material, which I have to at the moment overlook. But you might wish to pursue this point on your own. I shall be dealing with classical Hinduism. And in this form of Hinduism, we get a reversal of our normal Abrahamic or Western concept of the idea that the universe did not exist at a certain point in time and came into being at a particular point. And in the beautiful language of the Quran, God said kun, to be, and there was the universe. Of course, then it wasn't there before that. And so it has a beginning point, and it also has an end point. And again, in the graphic language of the Quran, when the sky will be rolled up like a parchment. Right? So there is an end point. And this is our more conventional way of looking at things. There's a beginning and there's an end. In most of, not all, but most of classical Hindu thought, these 2 points are not admitted. There was no beginning, there was no first, and there is going to be no last. So we are in the universe has always existed in some form and will exist and continue to exist in some form. Now of that we got two versions. One is a linear version, straight on, that it is just like as it was now, which is actually a minor view in the text. The major view is that that there is no beginning and no end, as in also this. But unlike in this, different from this linear view, unlike the linear view, and this is the main view, the universe undergoes phases of manifestation and dissolution. So you have a kind of, let us say, bump. So there's a period of quiescence, and then you have, this was my idea behind the bang, bang, bang. And it goes on like that. Calculations have been made actually. I am arithmetically challenged, but the basic unit of calculation of this time is called a kalpa, which is, I think, 300 years multiplied by 1,000. One unit of measurement, like light year. So these are the units in which it is measured. So it's an immense duration of time. That's where the famous parable comes in when the Buddha was asked, what is the duration of a kalpa? And he said, well, there is a mountain which is 10 leagues in length and breadth and all, and height. And if I were once in 1,000 years to gently brush it with the finest silk from Benares, then it will sooner wear out than the kalpa would come to an end. So you get this enormous concept of time. Buddha is already 6th century BC. Okay, so this is my second introductory point. And the third has already been made, that although the world universe is without beginning and end, intermittent creation and destruction or termination of the universe is allowed for. Now, the last 3 points have to deal with the fact that the notion of reality in Hinduism, and the kind of thought we are going to discuss, has certain distinguishing features we need to keep in mind. One of them is, and this was the point was made yesterday, that in Western thought, and the idea behind creatio ex nihilo is that God is totally transcendent, beyond creation. God creates. There's creation, there are creatures, and the God is transcendent, totally beyond them. Now, in most of Hindu thought, well, it's the way it was explained to me is the idea of immanence and transcendence, that 5 and our professor explained it to us. The term, the number 3 is immanent in 5. And the number 5 transcends 3, right? The concept of God in Hinduism is both immanent and transcendent. So God is both in the world and beyond it. And for this position, they had to coin a special word in English, and it was called, and many of you must be aware of this already, panentheism. It is not pantheism because God is not exhausted by the world, It is not theism in the normal sense, because God is also in the world. So it is called, I think Jaspers came up with this, panentheism. So the concept of God in Hindu, most of Hindu thought is panentheistic. Okay. Then Hinduism also distinguishes between two dimensions of the ultimate reality, which is with attributes, like a God in the conventional sense, and one without attributes, more like the absolute of the philosophers. And however, this absolute is transtheistic, it is not atheistic. Buddhism is atheistic, doesn't believe in a creator God at all. Hinduism does have a creator God for this bang in motion. So, but in some ways it is similar to Buddhism in that it goes beyond God. You might say Buddhism bypasses God and Hinduism goes beyond God. So you have atheism, the Buddhistic kind, you have theism, the Western kind, and you have transtheism of this other kind of ultimate reality, which is beyond theism. Although I must point out that which of these two aspects, now it is accepted on all hands in most schools of Hindu philosophy, that the ultimate reality has both these dimensions. Both these dimensions. Just as Mount Rushmore has one face on which there are the famous presidents, and the other is bare. One dimension of the ultimate reality is without distinguishing attributes, bare. The other has distinguishing attributes like the four faces. And there's a perpetual debate in Hinduism from its very inception and to this day, which of these two is the ultimate, ultimately ultimate. But all contestants to this debate accept that both these aspects form part of the ultimate reality. That is, it is the same mountain. Whether you look at one face of it with the figures or to the other, which is bare. Finally, the sixth point, is that Hinduism provides for what is called living liberation or embodied liberation. The technical word for that is Jivan Mukti. Jivan means while living. Mukti means liberation or salvation. And this is very important from the Hindu point of view, because traditionally religion, and certainly Abrahamic religions, posit the state of salvation as post-mortem. You are saved after death. But what this concept does is, it brings Hinduism in its own perception very close to science. That what you are saying is a testable hypothesis, it's a falsifiable hypothesis. You go Jainism, Buddhism, large sections of Hinduism say, look, this is what we are saying. You have to accept what we are saying to follow the program. But once you follow the program, you will have the realization. And the truth will be yours by direct experience. So as in science we say, okay, if you don't believe water is gas, two gases, conduct this experiment. So you have to have enough faith or confidence to conduct the experiment. That is the only faith demanded in those schools. You must do what we are telling you, but the results are independent of your believing them. They have a totally objective character, and you can verify it. So what this does is, brings the methodology of spiritual practice very close to that of science, from the Indian point of view. But the more amazing thing it does for us, amazing or interesting thing it does for us, is to create a situation in which you can say that certain things are feasible but not statable. Because when you come back from this experience, you'll say, well, I can't say anything about it. I can tell you how to have it, but it is so different from anything we have in this world that anything I say about it would mislead you. So it is feasible. I owe this expression to our famous Hindu philosopher, B.K. Matilal, taught at Oxford for several years, held this Paulding chair, and also in Buddhism. In fact, all systems which acknowledge this will often use this idea. Okay. Now, with these introductory remarks, let me get down to schematic and systematic treatment of the schools. Now, there are 9 Indian thought, and now I'm covering Indian thought, not just Hindu thought. Indian thought has been divided into 9 schools for convenience by modern scholars, and it has some basis in the traditional doxographies, so it's not outrageous. The first school of Hindu thought is known as Hindu materialism. Now, if you ask the Hindu materialist, why is there anything? He says, forget the question. There are things. Have a good time. This is their basic doctrine. There are also more sophisticated version that what you call, well, then you say, well, but, everything is material. How can it be? Consciousness is immaterial. And then they give the example of something which every Indian knows. It is a mouth freshener you take after meals. It is made of betel leaf and which is green in color. And you put a little bit of lime on it, which is white in color. And then you put a nut which is brown in color. And then you fold it up and consume it. When it mixes with your saliva and you spit it out, its color is red. This is the traditional Indian example of how consciousness can emerge, new property can emerge out of things which are material. So in that respect, they are like modern scientists, scientific materialists. That consciousness is a byproduct of material processes. So they will bypass the issue of why is there anything. And now I come to the school of Jainism, separate religion and a major school of Hindu thought. And Jainism would say, Jainism believes in a fundamental duality of matter and spirit or consciousness. Now, this is a very interesting point, which also will come up later. So let me address it right now. See, as they say, all philosophy is philosophy 101. Right? And the 101 status here is this. I am standing here. I see you people and I am trying to exchange thoughts. This is a material process, right? Let us accept that at the moment. I am holding this paper in my hand, there's a watch, table. These are material things. So our normal experience of life equally vouches for two dimensions of experience, material and immaterial. Now, most of Indian thought can be reduced, I don't know, maybe even Western thought, can be reduced to the attempt by one of these to reduce the other to it. So idealism says that only consciousness is the ultimate reality and matter is a byproduct of that. The typical Hindu example is body is sentient, but it produces nails and hair which are insentient. So consciousness can produce matter. I mean, as an example. To establish the plausibility of the idea, we give this example. The other schools say, like the Hindu materialists, no, you've got it wrong. Only the material dimension is the real one. The other is the epiphenomenon. We saw that example recently. Hindu thought in general has this idealistic orientation of the first kind. But Jainism and other schools in Hinduism, Vedantic Hindu thought has that idealistic orientation. But the Jains say, no. If both are given an experience, Both are experienced as real. We don't think they are reducible to each other. Both represent eternal truths or verities or facts. So the question should be not why is there anything, but why are these two things? Consciousness and matter. And of course, from here you can see also another possible rendition of our title. And in fact, from the idealistic point of view, that would be the right one. They would say this whole question is misplaced. The real question should be, why is there any one? Because unless there is a center of consciousness, which is what the one represents, you can't even know that there is something. It may be there. And so that is the real question, the idealist would say. Okay. Buddhism, the third school, will modify the question and ask. The real question to ask is not why is there anything, but why is there nothing? But the nothing they interpret in a very special way. They interpret nothing as no thing. And what they mean by that is that even as I am holding this, this is undergoing change. Things which appear solid are undergoing change all the time. Therefore, there is no thing. It is only process. There is nothing which changes. Change is the thing. There is no river which flows. According to them, we have created a fallacy, linguistic fallacy, by first substantializing that flow as a river. We have made it into a substance, reified it, and then given it an attribute that it flows. But there is no flow apart from the river. Buddhism knows no being, only becoming. There is no permanent substratum underlying either us or anything in the world. So we have to rephrase the original question. Why is there no thing? I'm reminded of an anecdote here of Professor Langdon Gilkey meeting Professor Masao Abe. Masao was a Zen master and scholar also, probably known to some of us here. And they started the discussion, and Professor Gilkey said, famous theologian from Chicago, so we must start with being. And Professor Abe said, why not non-being? And Professor Gilkey says that for half an hour, he sat in a corner of the room, just reflecting on this. It is how, to what extent we are the products of our culture. It never occurred to him in his entire life to think of anything other than being. Of course, we can say, what does non-being mean? And sometimes it means not yet being, and so on. But that's a secondary matter. The point is how culturally determined our formulations can be. Okay, now we come to the fourth school, and now I'm going to the Hindu thought. We just discussed Hindu materialism, which is also Hindu, but Jainism and Buddhism claim separate status as religions. Nyaya, or the school of logical pluralism and realism in Hinduism, does accept a creator, but only God as the efficient cause. This whole thing is managed by God, but this matter is already there. This pulsating universe we had, eternal pulsating universe. But then if you ask, why is there anything? Why does the universe come into being? They will say, it can all be answered in one word, karma. The karma, the actions which have to produce results, which have already been performed by various souls in previous lives, or various jivas or living beings in previous lives, in a previous age, aeon. In this part, have to connect with their fruits, because there is a karma in stock. And therefore God creates the new world for that process to continue. So why is there anything? Karma. The next school of Hindu thought, I just covered what is known as Nyaya, the school of logical realism. And it is often paired with this other school called Vaisheshika. Please forgive me for inflicting these terms on you. Vaisheshika is the school of atomic pluralism. It anticipates the atomic theory of matter. And why is there anything? Because the atoms have to be put together by God for that same karmic process, which is here, for which they use a different word called the unseen. That is the unseen potencies of previous karmas which have to be worked out. So the world is created and destroyed according to the moral deserts of individual souls, and for the proper realization of their moral destiny, both in Nyaya and Vaisheshika, with the Vaisheshika giving its own physics, as it were, of the atomic structure of matter. Now the other two schools of Hindu thought, which is also often paired because of the similarity, are called Sankhya and Yoga. Need not detain us for long, because Sankhya is also dualistic, like Jainism. It says you can't reduce one to the other. There are two eternal entities, matter and spirit. Yoga accepts the same position, but in addition to the theory, it provides a detailed program for achieving this separation of the matter and the spirit within oneself. We have a body, which is matter, and consciousness, which is a spirit. And so this yoga, here the word yoga does not have its general meaning of the kind of calisthenics which goes on in the name of yoga, or the idea that yoga is any system which unites man with God. These are all correct meanings. But here it has the specific meaning of a school of thought which has an 8-point program. It's all there laid out. What you should do, at the end of which you will yourself experience. It believes in living liberation. You will see yourself as two. Your pure consciousness, which is now mixed up with your mind, which is in this system inert, and comes to life because consciousness is reflected in it, just as a piece of metal may begin to shine because the sun is reflected on it, but is itself without any light or emits any radiance. So the answer here would be the same. We have to, where are these two things there? And with another question, how did they get entangled? Originally. For this question, Hinduism has no answer really. We'll see. It comes up later on. He says, what do you want to do? You want to find out when they got entangled or get out of this entanglement? So there's this additional wrinkle in yoga and also in Sankhya. How did this get entangled? Then we come to the next school of Hindu thought, which is called Mimamsa, which interestingly means rational investigation, the word itself. So you might think it is like modern philosophy, but it is not, because it is rational investigation into the meaning of the Hindu scriptures. Now, according to this school of thought, interestingly, this school of thought bucks the trend in the rest of Hinduism and accepts a totally linear view of time. It is a famous saying, the world was never anything other than it is now. And it adds, just as now we have lecturers and people in the audience, we have teachers and students, similarly, from beginningless time, there have been teachers and students, and what have they been studying? The Vedas, the scriptures of Hinduism. So the scriptures of Hinduism have no beginning in time, no end in time. And there has always been this transmission. Now we can see why it does not accept the idea of a pulsating universe, because it fears that this connection will be ruptured between teachers and students if we brought in that more regular Hindu idea. So it denies that. It denies God. There is no need for God. The universe suffices by itself. Because we don't need God as a moral governor, because karma takes care of everything. So for our question, it would say not the real issue is why is there not anything, because this school of thought is action-oriented. So it would really say the existential question is, what is to be done now that we are here? And of course the Veda tells us what is to be done. So this is how it's all very oriented to the scriptural text. Now we come to the final school, the ninth one, which is called Vedanta. It is so called because the Hindu texts are called the Vedas, and the word Ant means the last portion, like the Revelation according to St. John being the last portion of the Bible. Am I right? The fourth, okay, that's the fourth gospel.
No, you mean the book of Revelation?
Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Not the New Testament, but the whole book. So that would be called Bibilant, the last section of the Bible. See? If I had a book here, which I don't, so the last few pages will be Bukant, the end of the book. So according to this school of thought, that part of the Vedas, which is really relevant for our life, philosophical investigation, etc., all that material is contained in the last section. According to the previous school, it was contained in other sections, which lay down rules for ritual. But the last section deals with philosophy. So hence you have Vedanta schools of thought, and Vedanta is a totally living tradition in India. Major modern thinkers have produced their own versions of Vedanta, because those last sections are dialogues between students and teachers, are utterances, not systematic theology. Just as we have we do systematic theology on the basis of the New Testament, The New Testament itself does not theologize. It provides the materials on the basis of which. So Vedanta gives you religious experiences and the discussion and debates. And later schools try to systematize them. And they are called the schools of Vedanta. And just as all Christian denominations and theological systems would share something in common because they are based on the Bible or the second part of the Bible, all schools of Vedanta share certain presuppositions but also diverge in respect to others. Now we come to this school, which will probably take the rest of our time. Because of several reasons. This is the school in which our issue has been addressed with the greatest sophistication. This is the school which is the living school. This is the school which is taught in universities in India. Vedanta. And within it there is a school called Advaita Vedanta. And in choosing Advaita Vedanta, I am succumbing to prejudice. This is the school I was schooled in and the one I teach regularly at the university and so on. Now, the big issue about, one of the issues which arises in the Vedanta text, Vedanta is both the name of a textual category and also a conceptual category. So the debate which arises is what is the nature of the ultimate reality? And there, as we saw earlier, there is this theism and transtheism are both candidates for it. And this school of thought says that the ultimate reality is an impersonal ultimate reality called Brahman. And since Brahman is represented as the reality in other schools also, therefore it is called Nirguna Brahman. It is that version, form of the ultimate reality to which no empirical attribute can apply by any stretch of the imagination. Transcendent. So now we get into the thick of it. There are two answers which can be given from the point of view of this school to the question, why is there anything? One, of course, if we take the expression, why is there anything, in the direction of temporality, that why was there nothing to begin with, and then something came into being, and understand the expression, why is there anything in this sense, then the answer of the Advaita Vedanta is temporal, that there is no beginning.
What?
There is no beginning. Remember the concept of universe, the pulsating universe. So, beginningless here, and then you have these manifestations and resolutions, and it goes on. But there is no first. So that version of the question doesn't work. But now if we ask, why is there anything in the sense of, not the instrumental, but the intentional, why is there anything? It gives several answers. At one stage it says, there is nothing. Not just in the Buddhist sense. This is the most refined version of this school. In fact, the name for it itself is telling. It is called Ajativad. This doctrine is called the doctrine. Jati is connected with our English word Genesis, same root, Indo-European root. Means no, negation as in acosmic, ahistorical. The doctrine that no creation ever took place. There is no thing, nothing ever happened. And the standard example of this is how they explain it. This counterintuitive position is fundamental to the school. It says, okay, last night you had a dream. Was it real? If it was not real, it didn't happen. How can you say it happened? And if it is not real, but you say it happened, so you might say, it happened that the snake emerged because of the rope. Let's take the rope snake, it will keep chasing us. Oh, sorry, here is the rope coil, and here we imagine a snake on it. Now it makes a very interesting point for us particularly as philosophers. It says that this is the rope, and you mistook it for a snake. Was this snake real? You have to say no. Can you then say that snake was an effect of the cause, namely the rope? Was there any snake from the point of view of the rope? No? So, how can you establish any, when there is no real effect, how can there be a cause? So, this is the no causation doctrine. Nothing happened, or nothing is happening at the moment. From the ultimate perspective, it's very important.
We're live streaming that too, so.
That's also part of the snake. Okay. Now you say, well, this is a very kind of bizarre position. And for this to account, to take care of our concerns, they distinguish between two levels of truth. Also in Jainism and Buddhism, by the way, it's a very important Indian trick. The Indian rope trick, shall we call it? Yeah, to get out of this. Okay. They say that there's no point in giving the technical names for this. The first level, they say, is the level of empirical truth. Yes, we are meeting here. We are having this discussion. But it is empirical. It is less than ultimately real. From the transcendental point of view, this is not happening. And the example they give is, a modern version of the example would be, we said we'll meet tomorrow at 10. Tomorrow morning we will meet. Our concept of morning, evening is based on the movement of the earth around the sun. But does the earth move around the sun? Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, I got it mixed up. The sun moving around the earth, the idea of morning, evening, is dependent on the idea of the sun moving around the earth. Now see the paradox. We came here this morning under the belief that the sun appears to go around the earth, while all the while knowing that it is the earth which is going around the sun. So that this idea of two levels of truth is not too far out. We lead our daily life on the basis of these two levels of truth. Even the astronomers get up in the morning and say, I have to go to the office. And so they say nothing very far-fetched in this version of reality. So from a transcendental point of view, now of course the question arises, I'm almost out of time, so let me conclude. Maybe other points will emerge in the question time. Let me conclude with two quotations I found which will be very helpful at this stage. One of them, and there's a certain kind of, we will see. This is from Professor S. Radhakrishnan, one of India's most eminent modern thinkers. And this really goes to the heart of why is there anything? But of course in lofty philosophical language. If we raise the question as to how the finite arises from out of the bosom of the infinite, how does this world is to be related to that transcendent? How does the thing get finitized when by all definitions the ultimate reality is infinite without any differences within it? And here we see all these. When we raise the question as to how the finite rises from out of the bosom of the infinite, Shankara is the great formulator of this system of 8th century. Shankara says that it is an incomprehensible mystery, for which he uses the word Maya. We know that there is the absolute reality. We know that there is the empirical world. We know that the empirical world rests on the absolute. But the how of it is beyond our knowledge. In ancient texts it says it is like trying to be present at the birth of your grandmother. We are already products of it. But the how of it is beyond our knowledge. The hypothesis of creation is a weak one, and it assumes that God lived alone for some time, and then suddenly it occurred to him to have company when he put forth the world. The theory of manifestation is not more satisfactory or satisfying, for it is difficult to know how the finite can manifest the infinite. If we say that God is transformed into the world, the question arises whether it is the whole of God which is transformed or only a part. If it is the whole, then there is no God beyond the universe, and we lapse into lower pantheism. If it is only a part, then it means that God is capable of being partitioned. We cannot keep one part of God above and another part below. It would be like taking half a fowl for cooking and leaving the other for laying eggs, according to Shankara. Shankara believes that it is not possible to determine logically the relation between God and the world. He asks us to hold fast both ends. It does not matter if we are not able to find out where the two meet. I think I'll conclude with that. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Arvind. Dean, do you have to? You've got your connections also.
I'm sorry?
Got your connections also.
I believe so. I think I need this. Ta-da. Wow.
What?
All right. I'm not very good with these PowerPoint things, but I'm going to. I've been inspired by everyone else to rise to the occasion. So I was up till 2 a.m. hunting down pictures of philosophers. That's my big accomplishment here. So at least you'll get to see what some of these people look like, or what someone thought they looked like. All right, so why is there something rather than nothing? So I'm going to talk, my talk will have 3 parts. First, I'll trot out the traditional answer of the monotheisms, and including some versions of Hindu monotheism, as I understand it, a necessarily existing greatest possible being exists and is responsible for everything else. So I'll remind us all of some of the details and options there. And then I want to consider some attempts to say, yes, the question has an answer, but it doesn't have to do with anything necessarily existing. And I want to sort of poo-poo those ideas. And then, why is it number one? Why do we have two number ones?
It's called the Trinity.
Wow. Yes, I wasn't going to talk about the Trinity. I was going to be, more ecumenical, but it just sneaks in there. So you can see that I'm not in control of PowerPoint here. But perhaps a Trinitarian deity is. Okay, so let's start off by getting rid of this. Some say the question should be rejected. Now you can all boo and hiss. Boo, hiss. So he says things like, if a question can be put into words at all, then it is also possible to answer it. What? Why did he say that? Man has the urge to thrust against the limits of language. Think, for instance, about one's astonishment that anything exists. This astonishment cannot be expressed in the form of a question, and there's no answer to it. It seems like this is supposed to be an argument that if you cannot answer a question, then you can't express it in words. Well, we all know that this is false, right? So you can ask me, when did you stop beating your children? Well, I can't answer that by giving you a time. And you can do the same with why questions. Why did you stop beating your children? No, So a question can have a false presupposition and yet be perfectly meaningful. And the presupposition can be necessarily false. So why did you write Don Quixote? Now let's suppose that, like Borges thought, if anybody else had written those words, Pierre Menard or you or me, it wouldn't have been Don Quixote. It would have been a different book. All right. So suppose that's kind of plausible. Then why did you write Don Quixote? If you ask that of me, I can't answer it. And what's more, necessarily. The presupposition is necessarily false. But it's still a perfectly meaningful question, and guess what? I put it in the form of words. So we're done with that. All right. So one traditional answer, which shows that the question has answers that are at least conceptually coherent, we can understand the words, is that a necessarily existing being caused everything else. Now that is a familiar answer, and it would provide a nice explanation. So let me just trot out the familiar account of what this being would be like. There's Anselm. Anselm, well, he maybe gave two different versions of the argument, or at least you can sort of tease two different versions out. One of them is routinely dismissed, and rightly, as being sophistical. But one of them is not, and it gets contemporary support from Charles Hartshorne and, paradoxically, Norman Malcolm, one of Wittgenstein's acolytes, and Alvin Plantinga. The point is that if something is possibly necessarily true, it's necessarily true. And that's what these contemporary philosophers have reminded us. And so if it's possibly necessarily true that there exists an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, benevolent God, then it's necessarily true that there exists such a being. Leibniz was aware that what was needed to make this kind of ontological argument go through is a proof of the possibility of the necessity of such a being. But if there's a greatest possible being, and the combination of great-making attributes allows for the rest of them are compossible with necessary existence, well, then necessary existence ought to belong to the package. Surely if you're necessarily existing, you're greater than if you merely contingently exist. You're more resistant to things preventing you from existing, for example. So if it's possible to have all of these attributes together, then bingo, you have a necessarily existing being. Now, you also get this necessarily existing being out of some versions of the cosmological argument. So the 18th century form of it, most clearly formulated by Samuel Clarke, has as a conclusion that a necessarily existing being caused everything else. And William Rowe and his puppy will help me with the formulation of this, but it's basically Clarke's argument. So if we think in Clarke's terms of a being that's explained by another as a dependent thing, it's something that owes its existence to something else, and we think of something that's explained by itself, a self-existent thing, that's a thing that exists by its own nature, it's a necessary being. And then this expression doesn't come from Clarke because it's ugly, but a brutally existing thing would be a thing that is neither self-dependent nor existent. It's explained by nothing. Then we can formulate this argument and defend it in the following sort of way. First premise, every being that exists or ever did exist is either a dependent being caused by another or a self-existent being that is necessarily existing. Not every being can be a dependent being, so there exists a self-existent being. And it doesn't take much to get out of this that everything else depends on this being. The argument depends upon the principle sufficient reason. The way Clarke puts the principle is like this. There must be an explanation for, first of all, the existence of any being, and then for any positive fact, whatever. The first premise effectively rules out brutally existing things. It says your only alternatives are to exist in virtue of being necessary or to be caused by something else. And the first part of the principle of sufficient reason says if it's not self-existent, it must have been caused by something else. And the second premise also depends upon the principle of sufficient reason. Not every being can be a dependent being. A being's existing, a dependent being's existing is Clarke thinks, a positive fact, so it needs some explanation. And all the dependent beings existing, that would be a positive fact too, so that would need some explanation. Now that principle of sufficient reason is very strong, and it's very easy to doubt it. It would be nice if there were a weaker principle that you could use. And so, you might worry that, well, after all, why couldn't there be uncaused events, or why couldn't God freely choose something? So you might think to yourself, though, that even if there could be uncaused things or uncaused events or unexplained events, even if God might have to choose arbitrarily between possible worlds, say, still an infinite series of dependent things, each caused by earlier ones, would not have an explanation just in virtue of the causal chain. that remains within the series, and you could still ask, why did this whole series exist? And so you might think, despite your doubts about whether every positive fact needs an explanation, still there's got to be an explanation for the existence of any being, and also for the existence of any series or collection of beings. And that will get you the cosmological argument in that form. Now, the problem with this version of the principle of sufficient reason is it seems to be cherry-picked from among various principles like it just to get the result we want. So I'm not claiming that this is an extremely strong argument. I'm just reminding you how it goes. So here's our potential answer. There's a greatest possible being, one with absolute maximums of power, knowledge, and love, and it necessarily exists, and it caused everything else to exist. Now, if you believe in this sort of being, you have tricky questions to answer about time. One answer about the relationship between God and time is that God causes the temporal order, either with or without a beginning. So Augustine said, of course, Augustine believed that there was a beginning to the temporal order of things, but he didn't think that in order to have a necessary being who explains the existence of the whole created world had to be finite. It could have coexisted with God for eternity and still been dependent upon God. But anyway, suppose that God is outside of time in some sense. Some people who believed in this kind of being have thought that something like this: God is timeless, yes, but then as soon as he causes a temporal order with a beginning, he somehow gets sucked into time. Now this is of dubious coherence, I think. But on the other hand, I don't think I think there's a way to hold a view that's something like this that isn't just totally crazy. In the way that you might think you could have somebody who exists in two time series. He exists in a universe, the times of which are not temporally related to this one. You could say, well, in a way, that let's say that it's me, and I'm an English professor there. There's an aspect of Dean according to which he's an English professor, but he's now actually a philosophy professor. So timelessly, God could be a certain way. There could be a certain aspect of God that's timeless, but then God is doing various things at different times as well. So God has a sort of timeless aspect, but actually, because God created time, God's also interacting with us and sort of automatically in time. I sort of like this picture. A temporal God has always existed either co-eternally with a created order of things or solo prior to an initial creation. And you have that picture of God. I mean, the idea here is that really time isn't a thing. You can always add now to anything that's true. What it means to say that God created time is just to say that he pre-existed time and started things changing. Time is just the measure of change, as Aristotle said. And it's not an extra thing. So all God had to do was start changing things, and there was measurable time. But before that, it was, God could think to himself, now I haven't created anything yet. If you think of it as a period that isn't divisible and yet it has some length, you might not have to answer difficult questions about why God didn't create a little sooner or wait a little longer. Maimonides seems to me to have had something like this idea. In the beginning, God alone existed and nothing else. Even time itself is among the things created, for time depends on motion. on an accident and things which move, and the things upon whose motion time depends are themselves created beings which have passed from non-existence into existence. We say that God existed before the creation of the universe, although the verb existed appears to imply the notion of time. We also believe that he existed in infinite space of time before the universe was created, but in these cases we do not mean time in its true sense. We only use the term to signify something analogous or similar to time. So if we want to say he did exist, but it wasn't really a period of time the way we think of time, well, one way to take that is just to say it wasn't measurable. There wasn't any kind of metric to it. But it's not the case that it was short or long. It just was. I don't know. So there's various possibilities here, but this is our traditional potential answer, our greatest possible being with these absolute maximums necessarily exist and caused everything else. So if this is false, it's necessarily false, but it sure would be a good answer if it was true. Well, what I mean by good is that it would have a lot of explanatory power. Now, I don't really know what it is, what it is to explain something. Is that a real genus, and we can sort of trot out what it takes to be a good explanation or what it takes to be a good answer to why questions. But certainly if you can rule out all the alternatives and show that something unconditionally had to be the case, then you've got a pretty good answer to a why question. Often we're satisfied with something less than that. As others have pointed out, why questions sometimes are answered by how answers. If you want to know why something occurred and you're told the mechanism by which it came about, that does explain. That's sometimes what you want to know when you ask why. Some why questions are answered by deriving something from something else. So, if I want to know why the hypotenuse of a right triangle is incommensurable with the sides, and you can prove it to me, you've shown me from these other principles. Given those other principles, now I understand why it's the case. You can derive one law from another, more basic law. And these are good answers too, but if they rule out alternatives given certain presuppositions, but if you can rule out alternatives altogether, well, that's a great explanation. So often explanations or answers to why questions will take the form of attributing a kind of modal status to something. It's a matter of absolute necessity, or it's a matter of causal or nomological necessity. All right. Oh, one thing I was going to say about time, I forgot to say this. Sometimes people say, well, the Big Bang shows us that God couldn't have existed before time because if the Big Bang model is right, there's this manifold and there's no times before it. And this has never seemed to me very convincing. I mean, what it presupposes is the only good candidate we have for the notion of a time is a slice of this manifold. That's what times are, and there couldn't be anything, there couldn't be time otherwise. And, well, no. I mean, that's not the only candidate there is for being times. There are things like Julian Barber's complete state descriptions. Some of those, or maximal propositions describing everything, the way everything is. Some of those are true, and then they go false. And there might have been a truth about how things were prior to creation, even if there weren't any manifolds to slice. Anyway, so other answers appeal to a necessarily existing being of one sort or another, and they would be good answers too if they were true. And at the end, I want to just talk about a couple of those other alternatives. But can you give a good answer without appealing to either a necessarily existing thing or to the idea that necessarily something or other exists? And there's two kinds of answers that have been floated recently that I want to just throw out on the table, and I don't know exactly what to think of them, but maybe you all can help me. One of them appeals to some kind of nomological necessity or causal necessity and says, as a matter of causal necessity, there's something. And because this is a modal claim that sort of rules out alternatives as not really possible in some sense, perhaps not the strongest sense, but in some sense, it does seem to be a kind of explanation if it works. So you have people saying things like the past hypothesis is nomologically necessary. It's a law of nature. So why was the entropy low in the past? Because it's physically impossible for it not to be. We've heard we've heard David Albert sort of affirm that this deserves to have the status of a law. And Craig says, that's a real conversation stopper. If we say it's a law, then what we're saying is it's physically impossible for it not to be. Now, I don't know that Craig Callender wants to say this gives us an answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing, but you can see how someone might want to take the ball and run with it and say, well, at least I've given a causal explanation of why there's something rather than nothing. It's a law of nature that the universe started out with mass energy in such and such a state. And there's something like this kind of explanation going on when Stephen Hawking says things like this, which I'm sure you've all, this is probably a headline as opposed to you didn't have to read the book to get this statement. It came in your email inbox, I think, the announcement that God is not necessary. So I have just hazy thoughts about these kinds of explanations. If something like the past hypothesis deserves the name of a law, I think it's only because we're thinking of laws in a kind of Humean way, where to be a law, you have to be exceptionless and play a certain role in a certain kind of description of the big manifold of everything. And these laws are true because they are exceptionless and because the manifold is neat and tidy. And the manifold isn't that way because these kinds of Humean laws are true. So they're not oomphy enough for me. And if they're true in virtue of the stuff in the world that makes them true, then they can't very well explain why any of that stuff exists at all rather than not. And then I want to say laws with oomph that really describe why things have the propensities and powers and so on that they do. Those are descriptions of the propensities and powers of things, fields, particles, and so on. And so they presuppose the existence of something to be doing the pushing and pulling. Now these are hazy thoughts. There's something on the order of what Peter Van Inwagen was saying on the first day. What kind of powers are these laws? Are we supposed to think that these laws have? If they would have no force were there nothing, then they can't explain why there's not nothing. That's my gut reaction to these. So these kinds of explanations of why there's something rather than nothing by some kind of causal laws don't seem very good to me, but perhaps some of you will do better than give this a better run for its money than I've done. Another kind of attempt to explain why there's anything at all. Isn't that an impressive picture? I wish someone would take a picture of me that was that impressive. But is to appeal to contingent, non-causal explanatory principles. That's Derek Parfit. Derek Parfit, in a famous couple of papers, distinguishes, makes a distinction that we've been working with from time to time here, distinction between cosmic possibilities and local possibilities. A cosmic possibility is a complete way that everything could be. So if there are many universes disconnected from this one, well, a complete way that a way for everything to be includes those. A local possibility is a way for a single universe to be. It's a way for a maximal connected space-time universe to be. And so if you're asking why is there something rather than nothing, you're asking about the big cosmic possibility. And one possible answer to the question, what is that big cosmic possibility like, is that it's just this local universe. That's it. There aren't any extra ones. Another possible answer is that there's tons of these other things. Parfit takes inspiration from John Leslie, who defends a view that he calls axiarchism. I don't know, did he come up with that name? Do you know, Peter? No? Okay. I think he might have done. I haven't seen it before his work. The idea that he has is that the goodness of the universe explains why it exists. What exists is the best possible cosmic possibility, and it's no coincidence that the best one exists. And he says, you can make this thing, this kind of explanation run without supposing that the best possible cosmic possibility contains God, contains a creator, an individual, a person who caused everything else. Cut out the middleman is basically the idea. So John Leslie suggests that a cosmic need, otherwise describable as a huge and unified set of needs for a world's vastly many elements, is creatively effective. The universe exists because it ought to. Its presence is ethically required, this requiredness proving sufficient to produce it. Parfit. Now, so one thing that's not totally clear in Leslie, I think, is whether he thinks this principle, whether he thinks that the fact that the universe is the best possible universe and the fact that this explains its existence, that these are necessary truths. If so, then we're back with a necessary existence explanation. But Parfit interprets him as meaning that this is a contingent explanatory factor. The goodness of the world contingently explains its existence. The null possibility, nothing, is a genuine possibility. So the principle didn't have to sort of take effect. And what Parfit calls a description that the universe might have and that might explain the existence of everything, he calls that kind of thing a selector. Being the best cosmic possibility is the one that Leslie thinks the world has, and he thinks that it explains the world. Other things that Parfit considers are being the best cosmic possibility, or the biggest, I mean, being the worst. Actually, he doesn't consider that one, but I don't see why that wouldn't be a possible selector too. I mean, it's striking. It would be striking if the world were that way. Being the cosmic possibility with the neatest laws of nature, and so on. Now, some people can get into the swing of this, and others can't. I find it a little difficult to get into the swing of it, but I think the feeling we're supposed to have is this. If you looked around at the world and discovered that it had some striking feature, if it was of striking way, like it was the biggest, the most maximalist, multiverse that's possible, you might go, wow, that's kind of surprising. That couldn't just be an accident. So you're supposed to think, well, it might be no coincidence that it has this feature. But then you're also supposed to back away and say, but that's not necessary. That's not a necessary truth that what exists has this feature. So it happens that it has it. Given that it has it, it's surprising. It'd be less surprising if it was no coincidence. So maybe it's no coincidence. So that's how these explanations are supposed to go. The actual cosmic possibility has some feature, F, and it's having this feature explains why it is actual. And one possibility that Parfit takes seriously is that there is no selector. And then he gets going on regresses too, like, well, what is there a selector for the selector? And maybe it's a brute fact that one selector is the selector. On the other hand, our robust sense of reality or our robust sense of explanatory power and what sorts of principles can explain things may pull us back to earth here. And I wish Peter could probably do a good imitation of Richard, but it would be great if someone could. But I can do the little laugh that Parfit suggests that there might be axiomatic principles. Swinburne's delivery of this would be very convincing, because he just has this way of making it seem dead obvious. But I'll read it flat. Parfit suggests that there might be axiomatic principles which produce events because it is good to do so. But there are no plausible examples of such principles at work in the world. When food appears on the tables of the hungry, it does not appear there because it is good that it should, but because some person, that is a substance, caused it to be there because that person thought that it was good that it should. And that does seem right as a response to axiarchism, as a contingent thesis about why the world exists, assuming that it's the best possible world. And the other potential selectors also seem to be like this. They just can't explain the existence of things by asserting that they're explained, and yet they're contingent. It's contingent that they're so explained. I don't know. So again, my thoughts on this are hazy, but I take it my job here is to trot out some answers, potential answers, or attempts to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? So let's go on then to the final, and this will be brief and very incomplete, consideration of some other potential necessarily existing things that could explain everything else. Rationalistic minds here and there, everywhere, have sought to reduce the mystery. Some forms of being have been deemed more natural, so to say, or more inevitable and necessary than others. So the problem with my initial traditional potential answer, which you've all been, anxiously wanting to nail me to the wall about, is just things like the greatest possible island, which would have necessary existence too, if such a thing were possible. And connecting necessary existence with a bunch of other concepts doesn't automatically get you something that could possibly be. So why should we think that just because we can sort of say the words and it seems coherent to suppose that necessary existence is combined with, is possibly combined with being a person, being all-powerful and all-knowing and so on? Why should we think that such a thing is really possible? After all, we can combine those concepts, combine the concept of a necessarily existing thing with the worst possible being, and it would seem to be worse if you couldn't prevent it from existing. So, so the worst possible being would also have necessary existence, and boom, you've got a kind of dualism of good and evil as a matter of necessity. So we should be wary of compounding necessary existence and other concepts together, and supposing that you get something that's genuinely possible when you do that. Leibniz, as I noted earlier, thought that he had a nice proof of the compossibility of all God's attributes. And it's interesting in its way, but it's not very convincing. All positive attributes are compossible, and all the perfections are positive attributes, or something like that. So we should be wary of supposing that because we can coherently compound a concept that includes necessary existence, then it's a genuinely possible kind of thing. However, philosophers today, anyway, are a lot less reluctant than they once were to suppose that there could be necessarily existing things. So at one point it was thought that, I don't know, Kant has proved, or somebody has proved, A.J. Ayer has proved, that all necessities are either trivial definitions or true by convention, or something like that. And you can't get the necessary existence of something out of definitions and pure logic, or something like that. People aren't so confident of that anymore. The doctrines that led to it aren't very stable. And so the idea that there might be necessarily existing things is taken very seriously by metaphysicians these days. And candidates for necessary existence are things like numbers, maybe all numbers, or maybe, was it Hawking who said something about the integers being... Okay. Boy, that was... And all the rest is the work of man. So maybe just some numbers. Propositions, universals, some other kinds of things have been... The hierarchy of sets, if you're talking about the empty set and those kinds of sets as opposed to sets of contingent things. So these have been taken seriously as candidates for necessary existence. So why not something that has some causal oomph? Or why not something that could explain everything else by just being that everything else? So perhaps the universe as a whole is a necessarily existing thing. Once we take the idea of necessary existence seriously, these become genuine explanatory possibilities anyway. Now, it's very hard to say what exactly makes it plausible or implausible to attribute necessary existence to something. Maybe you can attribute necessary existence to the integers, but not the rest of the numbers. But you surely don't want to attribute necessary existence to the number 1 and no other numbers, I think. Well, I guess maybe if you had set theory. But it would be very implausible to attribute necessary existence just to Alvin Plantinga and not to Tim Maudlin. Okay, so there are certain combinations of attribution of necessary existence that seem unstable or inappropriate, and others that don't seem so bad. Now, I venture to say that the combination of if there is a greatest possible being, if that concept makes sense, and I think it's an open question. I mean, there have been people, perfectly orthodox Christian believers like Peter Geach who thought it didn't make sense, and they attributed something else to God than an absolute maximum of power, knowledge, and well, maybe he thought goodness had a maximum. I'm not sure, but anyway, he was worried about power for sure. He thought that the notion of an absolute maximum of it didn't make sense. But if there is a single combination of attributes which, were it exemplified, makes for the best possible thing that you could have, that's a very striking group of attributes. It doesn't seem inappropriate to suppose that necessary existence might be part of it, part of the package. What other proposals have there been? That's the last one on that list. Some have suggested that the universe as a whole is necessary, and by that they have meant this space-time universe. It is the one and only cosmic possibility. Well, it's the cosmic possibility that obtains, and it is necessary, and there aren't any others like it anywhere else. Others have said that the maximal multiverse is necessary, and we'll come back to that in a second. What's wrong with supposing that the universe as a whole, and it's just this single space-time continuum, is the one cosmic possibility, and it's necessary? It's a necessary being. Well, if it's a mere sum or heap of parts, then it seems like we know it's not necessary because some of its parts didn't have to exist. Things could have gone differently in the past. Determinism isn't true. Even if it were, it wouldn't be necessarily true. So things could have gone differently. Some different stuff could have existed. Just by tracing, a very simple way of figuring out whether something is possible is just tracing things back and seeing if you could unroll them differently. And if something is a mere sum or heap of parts, you take a part away, you don't have the thing. Perhaps, however, the universe isn't just a mere sum or heap. Could it be something more than a mere sum or heap? Could you suppose that this thing, this universe, although it's made out of all this stuff, could have existed and then it would have been made out of other stuff? And this I take to be a sort of panentheism. It's the view that the necessary being who explains everything contains all the physical stuff in the world as a part. But it isn't just that sum or heap. It's something that could have existed without those. Could have had other things as a part. So panentheism would be a version, I think, of this view. I think if you suppose that the universe is just this one whole, and it's the only cosmic possibility that's realized, and you suppose it's not a mere sum or heap, this is not a terribly arbitrary thing to choose as your necessary being. After all, it is the biggest thing. That makes it sort of special. And since it could have existed and had other stuff in it, these other possibilities don't immediately refute the idea that it's necessary. Mark Johnston is the most recent defender of this kind of view. He thinks that the universe as a whole is the thing that exists necessarily, and it's also the greatest possible being, or as he calls it, the highest one. Now, I'm not sure that the equation of greatest possible being with this whole is fair, however, and he gives a little argument for it. Suppose that there is something created by the highest one, but nonetheless distinct from the highest one, in that it is not some part, aspect, principle, or mode of the highest one. Call this other thing the separate creation. If there is such a separate creation, then we would expect the perfections of the highest one to be to some extent reflected in that separate creation. Consider then the joint reality made up of the highest one and the separate creation. It would seem that this joint reality might be a more appropriate object of worship than the subpart of the reality that is the highest one, or at the very least, the joint reality would be an appropriate object of fealty that was not identical with the highest one. But this is inherently at odds with our principle that the highest one and only the highest one deserves worship, so there is no separate creation. Well, it's not at all obvious to me that the joint reality in question would automatically be an appropriate object of worship or fealty. A person plus a rock, even a valuable rock, is not a proper object of fealty or love, even if the person is. The sum of the two might be worth more in some sense, but it would not thereby become a proper subject of these attitudes. It might even reflect the person. The rock might have been carved by the person to look like them, and still it wouldn't be appropriate to shift your attitudes of love from the person to the whole. So if the person is infinitely valuable, then even if the rock was worth a little something too, adding the rock and looking at the larger whole, it wouldn't be worth more. And furthermore, if the whole includes some bad stuff, adding it to a very good proper part will yield a worse whole, setting aside the case of an infinitely good part and a bad part that's not infinitely bad. And our world does indeed seem to include some very bad stuff. So if Mark Johnston's line of thought were plausible, then I should have thought you would include only the good stuff. And you wouldn't have a kind of panentheism. You would have, a kind of materialism where a proper part of the universe is God. But this is just one version. Mark Johnston's panentheism is just one kind of panentheism. There are, of course, many other kinds. And I think because they identify the necessarily existing being with a striking thing that has striking attributes, it's not altogether implausible to combine that set of attributes and suppose perhaps that's a genuinely possible thing, in which case our question has an answer. The multiverse, the maximal multiverse, where every possible way that things could have been exists somewhere, well, that's a very, very striking thing, that entity, and you can't get any bigger than it. And combining necessary existence with that thing also doesn't seem arbitrary. It's not like attributing necessary existence just to Alvin Plantinga. Those philosophers here who are familiar with recent metaphysics will immediately think of David Lewis's conception of things. On his view, every way that things could have gone is a possible world. And every possible world is a maximal, concrete, physical, spatiotemporal universe, like ours. Now, and according to him, when we talk about how things could have been, when we say there could have been talking donkeys, what we're saying is there is a world of that sort, not this one that includes talking donkeys. Now, that seems a bit much to most of us. But that was his view, and he showed how powerful it was as a conceptual tool. We can be impressed by it, I guess. And of course, those of us who are metaphysicians are all impressed by Lewis, not just for defending this view, but for his contributions to virtually every part of metaphysics and many other fields as well. Now, one nice question is, if you believed in this thing, this pluriverse, this plurality of worlds, for Lewis's reasons, should you say that it is a necessarily existing thing? And the answer to that isn't obvious, and it's not obvious what David Lewis himself wanted to say about it. Kean Dors recently argued, I think, as I understand it, that what he should have said is that, yes, in the full-on, full-out quantifiers unrestricted sense, there are these worlds, and that's true from the point of view of every world. And there are talking donkeys. When you say there aren't any, but there could have been some, that's because you're parochially restricting your attention to this world. So on that way of looking at Lewis's metaphysics, it does provide an answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing. It's just not an answer all of us are prepared to accept. And of course, the multiverse, panentheism, the traditional monotheistic answer, these are not the only semi-plausible ways of combining necessary existence with some striking set of attributes. But if you want an explanation of why there's anything, I think that you need to back one of these horses and not appeal to merely nomological necessities or non-causal explanatory principles. At least if you're going to explain why there's something rather than nothing in one of those ways, I need to hear more before I'm convinced that it's a real workable answer. Thanks.
Non-mendaciously, 5-minute break. Make me not to have told you an untruth as far as possible.
It was really wonderful. Oh, clear as a bell. Oh, thank you. Well, there isn't anything terribly new in it, but I thought, I hope, yes, I figured that was my job. Oh, well, yeah. That's my favorite. Yeah, that's a wonderful. Pay no attention. Yeah. Yeah, I was up till 2 in the morning collecting all the pictures. I was inspired by, I thought, nobody's now, probably Joel, I think, is going to do something fancy. I thought, nobody's doing anything really super fancy. I ought to be able to do this. Now, Joel, you're going to show me up here with a real presentation.
Yes. I'm sort of an expert at this stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as the word stuff goes, you did very well. I'll show a
good.
fabulous video.
Good. Well, I'm just glad I didn't follow you.
You want to check that the sound is working okay?
Sure.
Yep. Let me skip to the part that has the music. So all of this is going to work much better with the lights dimmed.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, music's playing fine.
Yeah.
Okay, now the only issue is whether my voice will come out over the music, but somebody will be back there adjusting the balance, so it'll be great. So it's a kind of a spectacular video. That
Yeah, maybe that's
people will
enough
probably like
to
it.
to give an answer to the question.
So I'm going to leave it set to play.
Maybe this is a way for
Yeah, I'm not going to use that one. I'm going to use my own,
Quite all right.
which is much more powerful.
There you go. That's fine then. Oh, I was just, if you want, I'm sure you don't mind just rolling through, but if you wanted to click. Oh, wow. That thing is great.
Yeah, it's pretty